Alrighty, my friends. So welcome back to the last to the last video, I guess I should say, of this module. So what I want to take a look at here is invasive species. So your assignment for this week is to touch on either endangered and threatened species or invasive species. And I really want you to consider first, before we dive into the topic, is like, what could an invasive species mean? I want you to think of anything that is something that maybe you've encountered in your life, whether it be a plant or an animal, or even something within humanity, if that makes any sort of sense. So this video is going to focus on plants specifically, but I do want you to consider animals as well, and how that could really have a role in things as time goes on. So invasive species are defined as a non-native species whose introduction causes economic harm, environmental harm, or harm to human health. So I want to note here that invasive species does not simply mean a species that is not native to an area. It has to be causing harm for it to be an invasive species. So non-native just means that it was brought here or brought somewhere from a different location. But an invasive species is that with the additional part of the definition, meaning that it is harmful, right? So doing something bad, which is kind of, it makes sense, right? Like non-native seems more of like a softer part of the word, or a softer connotation of it, where invasive seems like kind of almost like there's a nefarious sort of connotation to the definition. So what could some of the impacts of invasive species be in terms of ecosystem level impacts? They could be that they alter disturbance regimes. So you could consider things like fires. What could make a place more flammable, basically? It could alter the hydrology, meaning that there's more or less water available for other species. Could alter erosion and or sedimentation processes. Or it could alter soil chemistry, meaning it could alter nutrient availability. So a few invasive species for California in particular, which you may not actually think as invasive, are that of the eucalyptus tree. So this came over, I believe, from Australia. And the reason that it's a problem, if you look at eucalyptus trees really closely, it almost looks like it's consistently shedding. And that shed is actually very flammable. And while eucalyptus smells amazing, especially when it rains, it's actually pretty detrimental to California because we're so fire prone. Also, something that I learned from some former students with their dogs, eucalyptus is actually poisonous to dogs. So if you have a dog and you are going for a walk or whatever, just make sure you're keeping them away from those beautiful eucalyptus trees. Then another invasive plant here in California is that of the ice plant, which is what this little cutie is here on the bottom here. You can see this all up and down the California coastline, so meaning right near that kind of beach area. And it may look pretty when they're in bloom. They can have these really, really pretty yellow or purple flowers. And I thought they were a natural thing when I moved here, right? Like, I'm not from California, so I thought that they're supposed to be there, right? But in fact, they are incredibly invasive. They grow extraordinarily quickly, so they can take over ecosystems very quickly. But also they have really, really shallow root systems along the shoreline. So this can actually can help almost in erosion as opposed to making it more stable. And this is something that's really, really important for our beach areas and the coastlines, right? Because, we love to live right on the coast. We love to live right next to the water. But the more that the coast itself, the more that the land is falling into the ocean, the less land that we have to live on, right? So generally kind of important for us to have that and to have less ice plant. I'm not telling you to go out and like kill all of these species, right? There and like poison them or whatever. There could be down the line repercussions of that. So this is where, again, regulations and having folks who understand various ecosystems and understand various species can then try to get rid of some of these species without causing harm down the line. Another example of impacts could be within a community and population level impacts, meaning that you could alter community composition or compete with native populations for resources or reduce or eliminate native populations. You could create conditions for non-native invasive animals, or you could reduce, or a species could reduce recruitment of native species. So that would be something called succession. And then lastly, the hybridization with native species. So composition, altering the community composition. If someone else kind of comes in and wants to play around within that community, that could have down the line repercussions, right? So say going back to like the Yellowstone, the Yellowstone part that we covered in a previous module, when the wolves were introduced, say that there was another sort of canine-like species that came in and tried to kind of insert themselves into the community of the wolves and the elk and the trees and all that kind of stuff. What sort of impacts could that have? Could it completely kill off the wolf species and then not even bother with the elk? So then we would then still have another like explosion of elk, because so it could be really fascinating in that sort of way. An example of great conditions for non-native invasive animals, a great example of that is English ivy. So that English ivy creates really nice conditions for snails and rats. So you're allowing other things to kind of live, thrive, and survive, which is kind of fascinating. If you look into various native species or native and invasive species, another one more on the animal side of things is that of wild hogs. And if you do a little deep dive on wild hogs around the United States and how invasive they can be, with very similar impacts in terms of the things that we talked about in the previous couple of slides, it's very curious and very fascinating, actually. So reminder here that these types of ideas can go into both animals and plants. So I want you to consider animal species that are impacted by invasive species. So native species being impacted by invasive, if you know of any, but also the assignment for this week is for you to potentially consider looking at invasive species. So you're also welcome, by the way, to explore both sides of that prompt. You don't certainly have to be limited to either endangered and threatened species or invasive species. So if this is something that you're passionate about, it might be something to consider looking further into. So thank you again so much for your time and attention, and I appreciate you.